Welcome everybody to the next iteration of the IITE seminar series. This time around, we have Jeremy Fox here from University of Calgary, who's going to be talking about highorder interactions and whether they are matter for large species-rich communities. I'm really anxious to find out because the title doesn't tell us whether they are or not. But in case there is doubt, you can of course read that. Okay, without further ado, please, Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you all for coming. It's great to see such a fantastic turnout, and thank you very much to the organizers for the generous invitation. I love attending and giving seminars. They're just so central to my intellectual and social life as a scientist. So I'm very happy to be able to speak to you all virtually, even though in an ideal world, of course, I'd much prefer to speak to you all in person. And so I very much hope that we'll get to meet in person someday. You should all come to the ESA meeting next August. Let me just pause here. I think somebody might need to mute themselves. I'm not sure. I can hear like sort of dishes in the background.
Yeah, I'll sort it out.
All right. I've tried to make the talk as interesting and fun as I can to make it worth your while to spend an hour with me here. And so I'm going to talk about some new work that's in progress. And if I'm honest, I'm not yet 100% sure that it's right. But I think a talk like this one is a good venue to sort of think out loud, put some interesting ideas out there, and get some feedback on them. So my subject today is higher order interactions. And that's a topic on which there's been a recent surge in interest among both theoretical and empirical community ecologists. But I'm actually old enough to remember the last surge in interest in higher order interactions because it was back in the mid-1990s when I was just finishing up as an undergrad and then starting grad school. So this is Billick and Case, 1994, which is an influential paper from a special feature in Ecology on higher order interactions. And I mention this just because I just want to say the mid-1990s were great, okay? There are lots of things from the mid-1990s that we should bring back. Some of them are pictured here. I didn't have room for all of them. So if people are bringing higher order interactions back, I just want to say, like, don't stop there. There's lots of other things from the mid-1990s that we should bring back, okay? So I thought I'd introduce the idea of higher order interactions with an example from the mid-1990s. So this is work from Andy Beckerman and Schmitz on the interactions between wolf spiders. So my point here, wolf spiders, they're grasshopper prey, and the grasses that the grasshoppers eat. And so it turns out that wolf spiders indirectly benefit grasses, not just by eating grasshoppers and so generating a trophic cascade, but also by altering grasshopper behavior. So it turns out that in the presence of spiders, grasshoppers move around less. So this is just a graph of the mean activity levels per day, the amount of time they spend moving around in control treatments without spiders, and then in the presence of spiders. And you can see they move around less in the presence of spiders. And that's because moving around is risky. It puts you at risk of attack. And because the grasshoppers are moving around less, it turns out that they eat less grass. And so the percent damage that's done to grasses by grasshoppers is actually a lot lower with spiders present than with spiders absent. And that's even if you glue the spiders' mouths shut so that there is no predation going on. There's merely the perceived risk of predation. And so this is an example of a higher order interaction, also known as an interaction modification. The per capita effect of one species on another, here the per capita effect of grasshoppers on grasses, is modified by the presence of a third species, here the spiders. So that's just one example. But higher interactions have now been demonstrated in a sufficiently wide range of study systems that I think it's probably safe to assume that they are ubiquitous. Okay, sorry, just checking the chat to make sure there wasn't anything for me. So higher order actions, I think it's safe to assume are ubiquitous. So for instance, this is a recent-ish example from Mayfield and Stauffer showing strong higher order interactions among 6 competing plant species. Now, the mechanistic basis of these higher order interactions is not entirely clear, but the interactions themselves certainly are. Mayfield and Stauffer estimate that higher order interactions alter plant fecundity, so that's the purple bars, the HOIs, about as much as direct competitive interactions do. So that's the black bars. And so that is plant species A affects plant species B, not just by competing directly with B, but just as importantly, by altering the per capita effects of species C and D and E and F on species B. And further, these higher order interactions, these purple bars, seem to be quite idiosyncratic. Sometimes they increase fecundity, sometimes they decrease fecundity. And there's not really any rhyme or reason to that we can discern, at least as yet. What's going on here? Okay, there it goes. This seems worrisome, I think, is if higher order actions are ubiquitous, and if they're idiosyncratic in terms of their sign and their magnitude, then predicting community dynamics seems impossible, maybe for all but the most species-poor communities, right? I mean, as if being a community ecologist wasn't hard enough already, right? I mean, it's bad enough that we have to somehow estimate the per capita effect of every species on the per capita growth rate of every other species when those per capita effects are density independent. But if each of those per capita effects now, it also depends on the density of every other species in the community, I mean, we might as well just give up and go home, right? Unless the community maybe only has a few species in it. And I think that's actually one reason why the last kind of burst of interest in higher order interactions back in the 90s petered out, because they seem so idiosyncratic and therefore unpredictable. You're just left with a bunch of sort of idiosyncratic kind of case studies. I now think that's wrong. In fact, I think it's almost the opposite of correct. If higher order interactions are ubiquitous and idiosyncratic, then predicting their consequences is actually easier the more species rich the community is. Because it turns out, I think, that the consequences of ubiquitous, idiosyncratic, higher order interactions in species-rich communities are 0. Okay? So you don't have to worry about higher order interactions at all. As those of us who were alive in 1994 learned from the Lion King movie, Hakuna Matata, it means no worries. All right? You don't have to worry about this. All right, I apologize for inflicting my singing on you. Everything I'm going to talk about in the rest of this talk is actually the work of my very capable MSc student, Ross Connor. So it's his work in progress. So this is simulation-based work, although later on I'm going to supplement it with a sort of hand-wavy analytical argument. So we're going to study the effects of higher order interactions on community dynamics by simulating this model. And I'm sure with this audience, everyone recognizes this as a standard extension of the familiar lockable terra model of competition to include higher order interactions. So this is the lockable terra bit. So the population growth rate of species I just declines linearly with increases in the abundance of species J. And of course, species J might be the same species as species I. And the slope of that decline is given by this competition coefficient, alpha ij. So this bit of the model describes the dynamics of the community in the absence of any higher order interactions. It's just lockable terra competition. And then these other bits of the model describe the higher order interactions. So these terms, you'll notice, actually look just like the interaction terms, say, in a general linear model in statistics. So this parameter beta ijk tells you how increases in the density of species K alter the per capita effect of species J on species I. So that's interaction modification, right? Higher order interactions. And we've just, this model's, this formulation is from Letton and Stauffer, and they wrote it in such a way as to split up the interspecific and intraspecific higher order interactions. The intraspecific ones basically just work out to be nonlinear effects of species J on species I, but I'm not going to worry about the distinction between intra and interspecific today. So Ross randomly generated a lot of communities comprised of anywhere from 3 to 20 species with parameter values randomly and independently sampled from distributions that he specified. Note that the betas, so those parameters governing the per capita strength of higher order interactions, were drawn from distributions with a mean of 0. And so that's to capture the fact that higher interactions empirically seem to be quite idiosyncratic, right? So sometimes those betas are going to be positive, sometimes they're going to be negative. And so then what we do is we can simulate each community twice, okay, from the same initial conditions. And we simulate it to equilibrium. So we simulate the community with higher order interactions turned on, and then we simulate the exact same community with all the betas set to 0 so that the higher order interactions are turned off. And we discarded any communities that did not reach equilibrium in some reasonable amount of time, which turns out, as an aside, that you have to discard more communities when you have stronger higher order interactions. Because if you make the higher order interactions strong, you're more likely to get like crazy, unrealistic dynamics, like species densities explode to infinity, or you get some kind of wild limit cycles or something, which we never observe in competitive communities in nature. So, so we threw those out. So then, as I said, we do pairwise comparisons. You can compare the equilibrium abundances with higher order interactions to an otherwise identical community with the higher order interactions turned off. And we repeat all this for many different strengths of higher order interactions, which we control via the standard deviation of the distribution from which we're sampling those beta parameters, right? So if you sample from a distribution with a bigger standard deviation, so a bigger spread of values, the average absolute magnitude of the betas increases, even though the mean still remains 0. So here's what Ross found. Let me walk you through this. Each of these points gives results for one simulated community. So on the x-axis is the species richness of the community from 3 species up to 20. On the y-axis is the Euclidean distance between equilibrium abundances with higher order interactions and equilibrium abundances of the same community without higher order interactions. So the higher you are on the y-axis, the bigger the difference that the HOI is made to the equilibrium abundances. And different strengths of higher interactions are denoted by different colors, as given by the very colorful color scale here, going from orange is sort of the weakest ones down to through the cool colors and back to sort of purplish red is the strongest case. So 2 things to notice here. First, not interestingly, but I guess sort of reassuringly, if you make higher order actions stronger, they make a bigger difference to the equilibrium abundances. So these lines here, this orange line here near the bottom of the graph is that's the weakest case, and then as you go up, you're getting stronger and stronger higher order actions. So on average, stronger HOIs make more of a difference to the equilibrium abundances. So that's as you would expect. That's reassuring that it works that way. The more interesting thing about this graph here is highlighted by this red line. As you move from left to right along the x-axis, so as you go into more species-rich communities, higher order interactions make less and less of a difference. You squash this distribution of results on along the y-axis, right? At low species richness levels, depending on the parameters you pick, Sometimes higher actions don't make much of a difference, but quite often they make a lot of difference to species equilibrium abundances. But as you jack up the species richness levels, you squash this, and higher actions make less and less of a difference. So as far as I'm aware, this is one of the first broadly applicable predictions about the circumstances in which higher order interactions will matter. In species-rich communities, in the aggregate, they're not predicted to matter very much, okay, in the long run. So what is going on here? What is the intuition behind this preliminary result? I think I have an answer, although it only occurred to me as I was preparing this talk, and so I haven't yet had time to actually firm it up. And in any case, I'm not actually a proper theoretician. I just play one on the inner tubes. So I wouldn't be surprised, actually, if someone in this audience can actually do this derivation in their heads while I'm talking and can tell me afterwards if what I'm about to say is correct or not. Okay, so like, Robin, go. Okay. So here's my hand-wavy argument. I'm actually going to start with some actual math from actual theoreticians from Wilson and Lundberg 2004, and now I'm going to extend their actual math by like waving my hands. So Wilson and Lundberg derived an approximation for the equilibrium species abundance distribution of a lockable terra competition community lacking any higher order interactions. To do this, they noted that the total amount by which interspecific competition reduces the per capita growth rate of species I, which is this quantity here, the total amount that competition from other species subtracts off from your per capita growth rate, is exactly equal to this quantity on the right-hand side. And so going from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, you're just using the fact that the sum of the product of two variables just equals the product of their sums plus their covariance. Okay. So now the approximation starts. If you have a lot of species, and if all these alpha parameters are independent of one another, then this covariance should equal 0. So in those circumstances, you don't expect any association between the abundances of the competitors of species I and their per capita effects on species I. Those two things should be uncorrelated in this circumstance. And in that same set of circumstances, again, a lot of species and the alphas are all just drawn independently of one another. You can also work out formulae for the mean competition coefficient that species I experiences and the mean abundance of the competitors of species I. And so those means turn out to be important. And so this is why this is called a mean field argument. And so with those means in hand, you can then work out an approximation for the equilibrium abundance of species I. It's approximately equal to this, and I'm not showing the formula for the mean abundance of species I's competitors. Okay, so all that's without higher order interactions. But I think that in a world with higher order interactions, you would end up with exactly the same approximation. Okay. And so, and the reason for that is because the mean beta in our model, remember, is 0. Remember, that's an assumption that we made because we assume that higher order interactions are idiosyncratic. They are equally likely to be positive or negative. And so when you do this same move that Wilson and Lundberg make, right, and re-express the total effect of higher order actions, right, with a formula that's going to look sort of like this, except more complicated, any term involving the mean betas is going to equal 0, okay, because the mean beta is going to come out to be 0. And then you're also going to have, okay, you're also going to have a bunch of variances and covariances. But again, in the limit with lots of species and the betas and the fact that the betas are all independent of one another, all those variances and covariances should just come out in the wash and be 0 in the mean field case, I think. Okay. I can see that, I can see Yuri's already trying to derive this. All right. Let me know when you've derived it. You only have a few minutes. Is this right empirically? Is this like a reasonable approximation to anything that happens in nature. I don't know. I am not aware of any empirical data that is precisely on point. If somebody knows of something, please tell me. Most experiments documenting higher order actions are short-term, and they only consider a few species. Okay, so if you actually wanted to check if higher order actions all have come out in the wash in a very species-rich community, you'd have to do a much more species-rich and longer-term experiment than anybody's done before. That'd be really hard, I think, even in microbial microcosms. A study system that I work in, I think the required experiment would probably just be infeasible. But maybe there are clever experimental design choices one could make that would make it feasible. And if so, I'm all ears if anyone has any ideas on that. So in the time remaining, I want to take a step back. I want to place the preliminary results that I've shown you today in a broader context. If ubiquitous, idiosyncratic, higher order reactions do indeed just get averaged away in species-rich communities, and that's an essentially statistical phenomenon, right? It's not really an ecological phenomenon. It's really just saying that if you average a large sample of numbers drawn from a distribution with a mean of 0, the sample mean is going to be 0, right? And that's an example of what Stephen Frank has called statistical attractors. Statistical attractors are features of data that are commonly observed basically because they're hard to avoid. And the feature is common because it's an all roads lead to Rome situation. The feature occurs in many different biological scenarios, so long as all those biological scenarios all have the same statistical upshot. Okay. And the normal distribution is perhaps the most familiar example. Thanks to the central limit theorem, we know that a normal distribution is to be expected whenever you're averaging or summing up a bunch of other variables. And those other variables could have any underlying mechanistic basis that you want. They can be distributed in all sorts of different ways. They could be added up in any old order. They could covary. They could not covary. And their sum or average is still going to be a normal distribution, right? So that's why biological variables is different as the birth weights of human babies and the number of bristles on the abdomens of fruit flies all have approximately normal distributions. The central limit theorem works. It's a statistical attractor. Many common patterns in ecology and evolution are statistical attractors. And I'm, of course, not far from the first person to point this out. For instance, some of the pioneering macroecologists, folks like Jim Brown and the late Brian Maurer pointed this out back in the mid-1990s. Right? The approximately log normal shape of most species abundance distributions is probably a statistical attractor. Population growth is multiplicative, and the log normal distribution is the multiplicative version of a normal distribution. So that's probably why many, many different ecological models can produce approximately log normal species abundance distributions. The ecological details don't matter that much. All that matters is the statistical phenomenon of multiplying together a bunch of numbers. My former undergraduate student, Jacob Rovere, and I documented a statistical attractor in the population dynamics of rare versus common species. Turns out empirically that the per capita growth rates of rare species that are rare on average, tend to be especially sensitive to changes in their frequency, their relative abundance. In contrast, common species per capita growth rates are not all that sensitive to changes in their relative abundance. That association, that correlation is a statistical attractor. You have to make very specific assumptions in order to avoid seeing that correlation in your data. In evolutionary biology, Rich Lenski's famous long-term evolution experiment shows that the fitness of a large, evolving, asexual population increases as a power law function of the amount of time it's been evolving. Stephen Frank has argued that that pattern, that power law increase in fitness over time, is a statistical attractor. It's driven by the statistics of extreme value theory. So you can make many different assumptions about the biological details of mutation and how mutants compete with one another and so on. And that would not change the statistical essentials of the situation. Unfortunately, though, so I think statistical attractors are, not that all patterns in ecology and evolution are statistical attractors, but I think some of them are. My impression is that ecologists mostly don't like statistical attractors. I mean, they don't like the idea of them. Back when I say this because back when I was a blogger, I ran a poll asking ecologists about various ways of identifying and testing generalities in ecology, right? We could do experiments in model systems. We could seek universal laws of nature. We could do meta-analyses and so on. And there were various other things. And one of the options was we could seek to identify statistical attractors, right? And it turns out that option, seeking statistical attractors, is pretty much the least popular approach to generality in all of ecology, okay? So on the x-axis here, only about 30% of poll respondents reported using statistical attractors in their own research, much lower than for most of the other approaches I polled. And only about 30% of respondents even thought it was important for other ecologists to use statistical attractors in their own research or to seek them out. So, I asked about that because, of course, even if you don't do approach X, you might still think it was important that, somebody does that. Only about 30% of ecologists think that it's important for anybody to study statistical attractors, okay? And now, of course, this is not a random sample of all ecologists, right? But if anything, I think that makes the poll results even more striking because, of course, this is just a self-selected set of people who used to read my blog. And of course, the people who used to read my blog are going to tend to agree with me on lots of things, right? Right. I assume there aren't any people who are sort of hate reading dynamic ecology. So I would, if anything, I'd bet that the proportion of ecologists who care at all about statistical attractors is actually like even lower than these poll results would suggest. And for reasons I don't fully understand, I think most ecologists just viscerally do not like the idea that some of the stuff they're studying might be fundamentally statistical in nature rather than specifically ecological. And I don't think that's just a matter of subjective personal preference. I actually worry about that because I think it can lead to scientific mistakes. For instance, when ecologists sometimes insist on kind of futilely trying to test competing ecological explanations for what is fundamentally some statistical phenomenon. So I'll stop there. Hopefully I've said enough to kickstart a good discussion. So thank you very much for listening. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And I have to say that I think it is of utmost importance to have public singing in these lectures. And huge thanks to you for humoring us with.
I think you're the ones who are humoring me on that score.
To our crowd. Anyway, if you have questions, please raise your hand in the participant list. But even before that, there is a question in the chat that I wanted to read out. I don't know if Tara has a microphone access. If you
all right,
do,
so yeah, okay, yeah, Tara, if you want to voice your question, please, by all means.
Sure, great talk. I loved your singing, and I really loved your enthusiasm. It made the talk fun and interesting. My question is a little bit naive, but what would happen if you had a sort of an ecosystem engineer species, one that has outside impact on other interactions?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think it's interesting from a couple of perspectives. So one is, I think ecosystem engineering is another example of, I think, of a phenomenon that's I think there was kind of initial burst of interest, but then kind of, I think, petered out to some extent because I think people got the sense that ecosystem engineering is such a broad term and encompasses such a large range of possible effect that species could have on others. Like any effect that a species has on other species via its effect on the physical environment is just so broad that I think a lot of people felt like is kind of idiosyncratic. And so it's hard to hard to sort of say in general what effect ecosystem engineers might have. So that's one possible answer, that it's just very idiosyncratic. I guess off the top of my head, I wonder if the effects of ecosystem engineers, because of course, by being an ecosystem engineer, that might be a way in which you could modify the effects of lots of species on lots of other species, right? You might imagine that there could be lots of scenarios in which ecosystem engineers would be kind of higher order interactors par excellence. They would modify the effects of lots of species on lots of other species by modifying the physical environment. In that case, though, that's kind of a different scenario of higher interactions than the sort of models that Ross has been working with, because in that kind of case, you might well expect some kind of correlations in the betas, right? Like maybe a lot of those betas, are associated with the ecosystem engineer are going to have the same sign. And so that's a different sort of scenario than a very different sort of scenario than the one that we're modeling. And you can imagine, so like I had a conversation with Bob Holt about this a while back, where he pointed out the example of like, you can sort of think of like canopy trees in a forest as ecosystem engineers and also as higher order actors, in the sense that like they kind of create the light environment in which all the other species are like interacting with one another, right? And so kind of set the background context. And so by modifying the environment in which all those other species interact, but they modified it in a very correlated way, right, for all those other species that are living under the canopy. So that's a different sort of scenario.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And we have many people who want to ask questions. Nadav, please go ahead.
I was muted, sorry. Okay, thanks a lot for the talk. I hope that I will learn one day how to deliver my message so clearly with only a few slides.
Thank you, that's very kind.
Yeah. Basically what bothers me here is May complexity diversity problem. So you showed us the parameters of the higher order interactions, but let me ask the following question: what were the size of the entry of the Aij matrix of the matrix of the lockable terra without higher order interaction? Because in one of your slides you show a calculation for the size of for the typical abundance of a given species in the lockable terra, again without the higher order interaction. And we know that this distribution is extremely wide, as you already noted in the one slide later. And also, most of the species are going extinct. If you start with 20 species and you put alpha Ijs at random, they are going extinct unless you choose your alpha Ijs to be small to begin with, right? Okay. So what were the parameters of the lockable terra matrix without?
So I probably should have written them down. I have to go back and look at Ross's draft thesis to look up the exact distributions. But the short answer is, yeah, we're choosing the alpha Ijs from distributions that aren't too wide. So depending on which parameter, so depending on the simulation, there might be there are sometimes some extinctions, a few extinctions. Sometimes there aren't, but yeah, we're not looking at the region of parameter space where the odds are very high that in a 20 species community that 18 of them are probably going to go extinct. So I guess the other thing to note, which you brought out, you're right, that that approximation formula from Wilson and Lundberg, those approximate densities, Wilson and Lundberg call them target densities. Those approximate densities can, of course, come out negative. Like if you plug in the parameters, right, for given species I's approximate density might come out negative. And Wilson and Lundberg, of course, do some simulations to show that usually, not always, but usually the species with the approximate densities that come out negative are the ones that are going to go extinct when you actually simulate things, but not always. That's part of why they're just approximate. So yeah, we're mostly restricting to, and the same thing with higher order actions. The range of higher order action strengths that we explored does not extend up so high that you are just like, 99 times out of 100, the community is just going to blow up. Because we we don't want to have to do like infinite simulations to get some like reasonable number of ones that we can keep with results we can interpret. And so, yeah, we're staying away from the regions of parameter space where we blow up most of the species.
Okay, I mean, I guess that the question is about the basic intuition here, because according to what I have told, the basic intuition for a system with many species is that this system has to be, if you are modeling it by lockable terra competition, extremely sensitive to small perturbations. So I would guess that according to that, I would guess that if you add now higher order interactions, it may cause many substantial changes and not average out. But
so okay. Yeah, but again, we're throwing those cases out. So yes, another way to state the message of the talk. I think this would be a restate. I think of this as a restatement of the conclusions, but it certainly puts a different emphasis on them. Would be that the reason why you don't have to worry about higher order actions at equilibrium in many species communities is either that they are weak enough to all average out, which is the result that I emphasize, or they're so strong that they blow the community up, and then it's not a species-rich community anymore, right? So either the higher order actions kind of all average out, or the community is not observed because it doesn't exist, because the higher actions were so strong and ubiquitous, they blew the thing up. That's kind of, I think of that as the sort of the ecological version of economists' old joke about why you never find $10 bills lying on the ground. Because if they were there, someone would have picked it up by now. Why do you not observe communities with many species communities with ubiquitous, strong, higher order interactions? Because if they were there, the higher order actions would have blown the community up, and they wouldn't be observed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry I usually don't do this, but this is a point where I think it is actually useful if I make a quick remark, maybe helpful, maybe not. So I know that my former postdoc advisor, Stefano, and his lab after my time have explored what happens if you shift the focus from whether a given set of species can coexist in a random matrix lockable terra model to how many actually survive once the community prunes itself down. And under broad conditions, it's approximately a binomial distribution, which means it's centered at S/2. So if we start with S species, then we tend to end up with with half that number of species. I'm just wondering, Jeremy, would that help you in the simulations, / would this result be substantially changed, which itself would be interesting, by including the higher order interactions?
Hola chicos. Hola. ¿Qué tal? Muy bien. ¿Está la biblioteca aujourd'hui?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question, Jurgi. And I see that my student Ross is actually, he wasn't sure if he was able to make it today because he has other obligations, but I see that Ross, you are here. Ross, you should write that down. We should think more about that. That's a good point and potentially I think that's worth following up. So we should think more about that. And Yuri, I may if I need my memory jogged, I may shoot you an email
anytime. And
of
course, thanks.
But I'll just quickly say I see a question in the chat about that poll result, and the interpretation of that poll result that I referred to at the end. And so I will put in the chat a link to the blog post with those poll results discussing them. So anyone who wants to follow up on that poll and what we talked about can do that. So there's the links in the chat.
Thank you. Okay, the next hand up is Abdel. Please go ahead.
thanks for the talk. I'm wondering about the fact that you had a lockable terra. Well, I guess it's not technically purely competitive. It could be mutualistic or predatory. You could have the actions.
The parameter values were picked so that it's competitive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
I
alphas.
guess,
the alphas were picked so that it's competitive.
Right. Okay.
Yes. The alphas were picked so that it's competitive. So the alphas were not chosen from distributions with mean of 0. I should have clarified that. Thank you. Apologies for not clarifying that earlier. The betas were, the alphas were not.
Okay. And then, so I guess going to sort of building off of that question, higher order interactions may not be entirely uncorrelated from the direct interactions, right? So you can imagine a predator, probably has a very specific response on the lower, the interactions between the trophic levels below it, right? So if we take like willow, elk, wolves, or something like that, we know that the wolves will have a very specific response on the higher order interaction between the elk and the willow, based upon the fact that the wolves predate upon the elk. So I guess my question is, once you start to add in these other interactions, and when you particularly start structuring them, can you go and say that the mean of the betas are 0 now? Or if you have like a structured community with very defined biomasses and very defined, like in a typical terrestrial biomass pyramid, could you then see like non-zero betas?
I think it's a very good point. In the kind of trophic scenarios that you're talking about, yes, I would expect the higher interactions to have some structure to them, and no, I would not expect them to all just average out in the aggregate. That's my intuition. I suppose it's possible that one could be surprised. But yeah, certainly certainly there certainly are lots of empirical. Put it this way. There certainly are lots of empirical examples, like you mentioned the story about wolves and elk and willows in Yellowstone, that example is the same kind of structure as the example that I gave from Schmitz and Annie Beckerman. There are lots of examples that one could give of higher reactions in a predator-prey context, a 3 trophic level context that have that kind of structure. Now, the caveat would be, do we know of lots of examples of that? Because lots of empiricists have gone looking for those kind of examples. And if they, as it were, search the space of possible higher reactions more randomly, would higher reactions still look kind of like idiosyncratic if we had a more random sample of them in the empirical literature? Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, my intuition is that, yeah, in the cases you're talking about, that, yeah, the higher interactions will have some kind of structure. And if they do, then yeah, the argument I just made does not apply.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Frederick, please go ahead.
Hey, hello, Jeremy. Thanks for a very, very nice, very clear talk. I was wondering whether some of you species-rich communities might not be more resilient to interactions in general, like even pairwise ones. So as you simulate the lockable terra system, we would expect that it's more difficult, as Nadav said, to maintain some of the species-rich systems. So if that happened, it would mean that perhaps the mean intraspecific interaction term would be larger than the mean interspecific term, like get much, much larger. And that would make that not only species being resistant to high order interactions, but resistance to interactions in general, like these communities would resist better to interaction because the intraspecific terms are larger.
So that's a very interesting, that's a very interesting point. I think a very important point. So yes, as you go up in species richness, and we're throwing out the ones that blow up or exhibit some other kind of they exhibit some kind of wild, crazy stable limit cycles or something like this. the ones we're retaining are presumably an increasing sample from increasingly non-random portion of the parameter space that we drew from originally. Yes. I know Yorgos Kokoris is one person, but there are others, Ted Case, who've done simulation work on that in the past in the context of lockable terra competition communities. So I would think that those results would carry over, yes. And so then, yes, you make a very good point. Then the question is whether that non-random sampling, as you say, basically you expect to end up in the sort of sub portion of the parameter space in which intraspecific interaction coefficients are especially strong relative to interspecific ones. Whether as a consequence of that, that is also what's making the HOIs like matter less.
But it might still be true.
Could be. We haven't checked yet.
I mean, the result is still relevant. It's just about the
yes.
Why that happens. Is that
yes.
Is that something specific to high order interaction, or is it a more general attractor like you showed with the negative frequency dependence, like as you add more and more rare species, there's increasingly resilient ones to the mix.
It's possible that something along those lines is going on. It's definitely something worth checking.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Next up is Mike. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Yuri. Thanks, Jeremy, for a really interesting, fun talk. I enjoyed that a lot. It's just what I needed this time of day.
Thanks, Mike.
In this part of the world. You just kind of answered the question I was going to ask, which is it's about this idea that the resultant distributions of interaction strengths, after you've gone through the selection of finding a 20 species community that will be locally stable and feasible, they don't reflect the original distributions that we start with. So I'm going to try and ask a different question that I haven't thought carefully enough about, which is thinking about the interactions and the number of dimensions that you have in a hypervolume. What does in that kind of niche space idea, what does a higher order interaction look like there? How are you bending extra dimensions in the hypervolume? Is that a useful way of thinking about it, or is that the wrong?
I should apologize. I'm afraid I may not be quite following the question. I mean, so the way as I kind of hinted at the beginning of the talk, I actually prefer the term interaction modification because, in that sort of throwaway remark I made, comparing these higher interaction terms to like the interaction terms in general linear models is actually the way that really helps me visualize them. Like you can actually rewrite like the per capita effect of species J on I. When you have higher interactions, you can actually rewrite that per capita effect as, okay, it's not constant anymore, but instead you basically got a main effect and then like an interaction term. So the per capita effect of species J on I like also depends on, in a linear way, on the density of species K. And then the way I visualize that is sort of the same way I would visualize interaction terms if I was doing it statistically in a general linear model with interaction terms. I try to think about, all right, so what is the per capita effect of species J on I I take sort of slices through that curved surface, that curved multidimensional surface, right? What is the per capita effect of species J on I when species K, the modifier species, has density 10? When species K has density 20 and so on, right? I take those slices, right, and try to visualize the interaction term that way. And of course, that's somewhat limited once you get to more than 3 species, right? Because you're taking like slices through this high dimensional curve thing that you can't really visualize. But that's the way I think about it visually, is to the extent that one can visualize these things. Does any of that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what I was thinking about. If you take your flat two-dimensional plane and then start bending it.
That's what's going on. Yeah, that's exactly what's going on. Yeah, in a lockable terra world, this is just a flat sort of multi-dimensional plane, as it were, and then the higher interactions bend it. Yeah.
So there was a talk earlier on in this series about, I can't remember the speaker's name. She did a really great job of kind of presenting what happens when a lot of these what's the right word? I can't think of the right word, but basically a lot of collisions are occurring in some parameter space, which I need to dig it out. I'll see if I can dig it out and send you the paper. But that might be a nice way of thinking about some of the things that are going on here as well. Or if anyone else from the audience can remember the speaker's name, and pop it in the chat, that would be really helpful. Remind me as well, because it was really interesting stuff. But yeah, cool stuff. Thanks very much for that.
Next,
there's a question in the chat that I'm just from Ava that put in the chat, and I just typed my answer into the chat. So if folks wanted to have a look at that. Ava asked a very good question about whether the use of Euclidean distances to summarize these results is perhaps misleading for reasons she spelled out. And that's a good question, to which I think we have a good answer, because we've also looked at other ways of summarizing those results, the comparisons of equilibrium abundances with versus without higher interactions. And they lead to the same, those other summary measures lead to the same conclusions as the Euclidean distances do, but aren't subject to the same possible artifacts that Euclidean distances are. So anyway, folks are interested in that. It's in the chat.
Good point, and thanks. Next, Violeta, please go ahead.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. My question was actually partially addressed by Barabas, and is why did you just take into account the communities that reach the equilibrium? Why you didn't take into account limit cycles or chaotic dynamics? Because from a dynamical systems point of view, of course, if you are adding more and more species and that are coupling in a non-linear way, chances are you are going to get chaos as a dynamical response. So why ecologists are so focused on equilibrium dynamics? When, in nature, I mean, we also have seasonality. It is said also that ecosystems are in the age of criticality. So I would like to know your thoughts about this.
Sure, good question. So a few answers. One is, okay, yes, some of these communities with many species and sufficiently strong higher interactions do exhibit some kind of limit cycles or chaotic dynamics. Actually, a lot of them just blow up, like species densities go to infinity. That really is like a case that I don't think is worth analyzing, that I would kind of put my foot down and say, yeah, I'm going to say that's not worth analyzing. Because you could all right, set some arbitrary stopping point to your simulation and say, all right, densities are going to infinity, but I'm going to do some analysis before the simulation actually breaks my, it causes an error message. I'm going to stop it early, right? I don't think that's a thing that's worth doing. So that's one thing. So then if you want to keep cases with, where the asymptotic dynamics are some kind of stable limit cycle or chaotic dynamics or whatever, or heteroclinic cycles or whatever it is. All right, now you have to figure out okay, what is the response variable that you want to ask questions about, and can you interpret the answers you would get from analyzing that response variable? So one response variable you might pick would be species, average over the attractor. Let things go to whatever attractor they're going to get to, if it's chaotic or whatever, and then take means over the attractor and compare them to the equilibria that you get in the absence of higher order interactions. You certainly could do that. You absolutely could do that, and there might well be interesting things you would learn. I think it would be harder. I think it would just be more challenging to interpret the results because those average densities over the attractor, there's going to be other phenomena going on besides the sort of phenomena that I talked about in my talk, right? Because you're going to have like you're going to have to take like nonlinear averaging into account there. And so I think the comparison with equilibrium densities in the absence of HYs would just get harder to interpret, which isn't to say it couldn't be done. And isn't to say that there are other questions one could ask, say about one could try to understand, the increasing prevalence of different sorts of non-equilibrium dynamics as you jack up the strength of higher order interactions and try to, that's just a different question than one could ask, but also an interesting question that's worth asking.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that's another very interesting question. With higher order interactions, new dynamics appear, so maybe it's worth to explore it.
Hey,
okay.
The person who should ask that question should be a better theoretician than me. Or Ross. I don't think Ross will be offended to say neither of us has the math chops to answer that question properly. Because I think to do that properly, you want to do more than just simulate a bunch of things and then just kind of eyeball the simulations and go, oh, that looks like a limit cycle. You want to do some proper nonlinear dynamics, and that's beyond our mathematical capabilities.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Next, Axel.
Thanks, Steve. See you, Steve.
Are you sure? Nobody else was before me? Oh, okay.
There were a couple of people, like Eva Kishti was there, but she wrote in, right. And otherwise I don't know any takers.
Okay. So
I'll talk if there are no other takers or Axel.
Steve, why don't you go ahead since you just said you had to run? So
okay.
Yes. Okay.
I'm not sure
go after.
It's going to comment or a homework assignment. What about space? How does this play out?
I was actually afraid someone would say that.
If it's interaction modifications and you've got something sessile, then it might say that interactions are different in different places. And maybe that's not going to average out. Maybe that's a source of variability that could have some impacts on the dynamics.
Yeah. Yes.
Is that your next paper?
No. Go ahead. Because that seems hard. Yes, the other thing that could happen in space, you could make it sort of even, I'm not sure if this would be worse or better, it'd be different. But if you have mobile organisms, of course, the other thing that can happen is I don't have to stand here, interact with you. I can go someplace else where I don't have to, hopefully, right? Right. I can switch rather than fight, as it were. And that, of course, is a whole nother can of worms. I feel like this is the way most of my theoretical talks go. I have I talk about some hopefully interesting idea about a very, very simple scenario. And then everybody asks me about, what about all this other stuff? And I just go boy, that would be interesting. Someone who knows more math than me should go do that. So by cleverly defining my space of expertise, I can. So I got this protective shell of lack of mathematics that defends me from questions like yours, Steve.
Well, Well, Ross says you need to buy him a bigger computer, and then he'll work on it.
Yes, I see that in the chat. Yeah. Nice try.
Okay, thanks. Now I do have to go.
All right.
But thanks for a great talk.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming by. Sorry, Axel and Geza, I'm not sure which one of you had the hand up. On my screen, it was Axel's hand first, but I don't know if that's...
Okay, let me fire off. So Geza always asked about unification. Where is here the unification theory? So let me make a few attempts. Well, thank you, Jeremy. Also for citing this paper by Wilson and Lundberg. So that's the mean field theory for Blood-Cover Terra models.
Great underrated paper. And I have a funny story about seeing Will Wilson talk about that I could tell later once we're done with all the questions.
And then there is an extension of this, where you don't only calculate the mean field theory for the mean, but also the mean field theory for the variance that you can find in that book that I wrote. And this could be applicable to what you're doing here, because it should be easily extensible to adding additional terms and seeing what the variance of these is and the variance of the abundances, and you can kind of crank the handle.
That's a very good point. Ross, write that down. That's a good point. We should look into that.
And then even nicer way of doing this theory is what Guy Bunin did. I think the very first talk of the series, he did it in a way that you can't do it analytically anymore, but you get the better results, more accurate results. And he also, by the way, looked at the question, if you now lose a few species and therefore modify the distribution of interaction strengths, what is the resulting distribution? He worked this out. And it has been tested by Mathieu Barbier in PRX 2021. So that is all understood. And then you can also look at the question that Nadav was asking about. Okay, so what happens if you come closer to the point where the community is saturated and species go extinct? I think there is a well-developed mathematical path. Just always people never include these high order interactions, and so it's extremely interesting what happens if you do it.
Thank you for pointing that out. As I said, it only recently occurred to me that the Wilson and Lundberg paper was sort of directly relevant here. And so thank you very much for helping us walk the next steps on this path of figuring out what other people have done that will help us interpret and extend this result. Thank you. Thanks, Axel.
Yeah, and it's not as simple as Stefano Alessino thinks it is. It's people have worked this out. It's more complicated.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
So I know the work from Stefano just a little bit that you're referring to there.
Okay. Next up is Geza. Please go ahead.
Unmute, and thanks for the lecture. And I'm from the very beginning thinking about what is the average of the beta. So it's not zero. Then, of course, there is no statistical cancellation. But also, I'm thinking if instead of starting with the lockable terra and modifying with higher order terms, consider some nonlinear dependence somehow, take the equilibrium point and consider the Taylor expansion around this point, and then, of course, the first terms are the pairwise interactions. The higher order terms are the higher order interactions, and then you will know that for a very small perturbation, only the pairwise interactions are interesting. If you have are interested in a higher perturbation, you have to take into account the third three-way interactions and so on. And I am more optimistic in this direction to see some structure.
It had occurred to me that my entire talk was just a long-winded way of saying, sort of making the very familiar point that if you're sufficiently close to equilibrium, any nonlinear model is a lockable terra model. Like if you're in that neighborhood, like that would be a way of making the argument. I think that's kind of the very short version of my talk is, if you're close enough to equilibrium, it's all lockable terra. And all the, so Taylor expansions work is the lesson today, folks. So that's actually that actually kind of leads into this, one of the nerdiest and also funniest jokes I've ever seen an ecologist make in a talk was by Will Wilson when he was talking about this work with Per Lundberg at the Ecological Society of America meeting. This would have been back in the early 2000s. And he was giving a talk, he was talking about this work, and he was walking through the derivation. And so he gets to the point where he's going to throw out the higher order terms. And he says, so I was sitting there and I remember watching with Robin Snyder, who's here today, and Steve Elner had to leave. We were sitting there watching together. And so Will's talking as he said, And so now, if you're smart, he turns right to Robin and Steve and he goes, if you're smart, you throw out the higher order terms. And I remember Robin and Steve just going, no. So it's one of the nerdiest, but also the funniest exchanges I've ever seen in an ecology seminar. So I was basically channeling my inner Will Wilson in this talk. Like, so, if you throw out the higher order terms, your life gets a lot simpler. And there are circumstances in which that is justified. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there other takers for questions? While people are thinking, I can ask something, and I hate to be yet another one of those whatabouters.
Just go ahead.
I want to pull a bag over my head first. So the example you mentioned at the beginning of the talk was actually a trait-mediated higher order interaction. And the thing that I was trying to work out when you told me off during your talk, or off or on, I'll let you decide, is if you would do something similar for trait-mediated terms, would you get some similar cancellation? And I wouldn't say that I understand this yet very well. But
so you mean you've got some? Because the way I think of those higher order terms in a lockable terra model, I think of all the alphas and all the betas in a lockable terra model is just you're implicitly summarizing some unspecified underlying, mechanism, right?
Okay, I see.
Is the way I think about it. So now, if you told me, I want to be explicit about the underlying mechanism, so I want some kind of explicitly trait-based model that is going to have some parameters to describe something about the morphology or the behavior or some other feature of the organism, some trait, as it were, that's going to change in such a way as to change per capita interaction strengths. I don't know.
Yeah,
I guess my answer would just be the sort of boringly obvious one that, well, if your trait-based model turns out to generate idiosyncratic higher interactions, well, then it's going to work out the same way that that I just talked about, and if it doesn't, it won't.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's kind of the boring obvious answer.
Okay. Yeah. No, I guess now that helped me clarify what I was thinking of. And what I have been thinking of is that when you glue the mouth of the spider shut, and yet you observe the effect, what that means is that intuitively at least, the functional form of that kind of higher order effect, even if we describe it fully phenomenologically and amalgamate the effects into betas, would not have the form of beta times nk times nl or whatever that was.
It
would be something a bit more, right? Okay, so that helps me think.
Yes, one could. Yes, that's a good point. Yes, one could imagine that if you specify the underlying mechanisms, that you do not get interaction modifications that even have the form of the functional form that we assumed of just multiplying together like interaction terms in a general linear model, multiplying together species densities. Yeah, absolutely. If the higher order actions you're modeling have some other functional form, I don't know what happens.
Yep. Okay, we'll leave that for the future. But for now, are there other questions? I take that as a no, but if somebody changes their mind, let us know. So, but no, nothing. No, I guess that's it. Then thank you so much, Jeremy. This was a great talk.
Well, thank you for all. This was a real pleasure. I really like how you structure things too with the shorter talks and leave more time for conversation. I think it's fantastic that you're doing this. I wish I'd kind of realized this happened sooner, or maybe I did know and I just forgot about it. Now I regret forgetting about it. But now I know this is happening. I'm going to try to attend as many as I can. I think it's fantastic that you're doing this. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you everybody else for coming. As usual, our next seminar is in, I believe, in 2 weeks' time. same time. So see you all there.
With Meron
everyone.
linking spacious self-organization to community assembly. This is the title.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, everybody, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.